I swung the silver tray before I even thought twice. The crash echoed through the dark hallway like a thunderclap, and the tall figure crumpled to the marble floor right at my feet. My heart was hammering so loud I could hear it in my ears. My hands would not stop shaking. The candle in my other hand flickered wildly, throwing strange shadows across the walls of Blackmere Manor. I stepped closer, holding the light over the face of the man I had just struck down, and my breath left my body completely. This was no thief. No burglar wore a coat like that. No common criminal had a jaw carved that sharp, or hands that looked like they had never touched hard labor a single day in their life. The gold signet ring on his finger caught the candlelight and nearly blinded me. I knew that crest. Every servant in England knew that crest. As this was Duke Rainwell, the most powerful, most feared, most coldly untouchable nobleman in the entire county. And I, Lettie Graves, a lady's maid with flour still on her apron, had just knocked him unconscious with a serving tray in his own home. I should have run. Every sensible part of me screamed to run. But his eyes fluttered open before I could move even one step. Dark eyes. Unfocused at first, then sharpening slowly, landing directly on my face with an intensity that pinned me to the floor like a nail through wood. He did not call for the guards. He did not shout. He simply stared at me, breathing slowly, and whispered something that made every hair on my arms stand straight up. You. Now, before we go further, tell me this. If you accidentally knocked out a duke, would you run or stay? Drop your answer in the comments to tell us where you are watching from, and please hit that subscribe button right now. You do not want to miss what happens next. The manor was completely still the moment before I swung that tray. I had been awake since before dawn, long before the other maids even stirred in their narrow beds. Mrs. Grubb, the head housekeeper of Blackmere Manor, had assigned me the upper corridor that week, and I took every responsibility she handed me with more seriousness than perhaps any task truly deserved. That was always my flaw. While girls like Dottie and Bess whispered behind the linen cupboard and counted the minutes until their evening duties ended, I was still moving through the hallways past midnight, a candle in one hand and a polishing cloth in the other, making certain every silver piece sat exactly in its correct and proper place. And the Duke was not supposed to be home. That was the thing nobody had told me. His Grace, Duke Rainwell, had ridden out to the Whitmore estate 3 full days before on a hunting party that was expected to last a fortnight. The entire house had exhaled when word spread of his departure. Mrs. Grubb's rigid shoulders had dropped half an inch. Even Mr. Fettle, the butler, had been seen smiling twice in one afternoon, which in 30 years of unbroken service had reportedly never happened before. Nobody said it plainly, but every soul under that roof understood it clearly. The Duke's presence inside Blackmere Manor was like standing at the edge of a storm. You could feel the charge in the air at all times, the constant and uneasy awareness that the weather could turn without a single moment of warning. So when I heard footsteps in the upper corridor at midnight, my first thought was not the Duke. My first and only thought was the silver. 3 weeks before, Lady Portman's estate not 2 miles from Blackmere had been stripped of its finest pieces in a single night. Candlesticks, a set of engraved cutlery, a pocket watch that had once belonged to her late father. The thief had entered through a narrow side window and was gone long before the household woke. The story had moved through every servant's quarter in the county with the speed of wildfire, gathering detail and fear with every telling until the version Dottie whispered to me over breakfast had included details I was fairly certain no one could actually know. Mrs., or Grub had stood before all of us the very next morning, with her arms folded and her expression carved from something harder than stone, and she had said that any servant of Blackmere who witnessed anything suspicious was to act without hesitation. Act without hesitation. She had pressed each word down like a stamp on hot wax. I had carried those 4 words with me every evening since, turning them over in my mind, the way you turn over something you intend to use. So when the shadow appeared at the far end of the corridor, moving without a lamp, stepping with the careful and deliberate quietness of someone who very much did not want to be heard, I did not stop to reason with myself. I did not ask questions, or wait, or hold my breath and hope. I grabbed the heavy silver serving tray from the hall table beside me, the one I had spent the last 20 minutes bringing to a mirror shine, and I stepped forward and swung it with everything my arms could produce. The sound was horrible. A deep, resonant clang that bounced off the walls and the ceiling and the marble floor all at once, filling the corridor so completely that for a half-second I could not hear anything else. Then silence. A silence so absolute it pressed against my eardrums. And then the slow, heavy collapse of a very large man down to the floor, right at my feet, with a sound that would live in my memory for a very long time. I stood without moving. The candle flame shook violently in my grip. The shadows on the walls leapt and swayed like startled things. Then I forced myself to step closer, to crouch down, and to hold the light close to the face of the person I had just struck down, and my blood went entirely cold inside my veins. I knew that ring. Every servant in England, with any real knowledge of the county's great houses, knew that ring. The hawk with its broad wings thrown open, one talon gripping a sword, the other closed around a laurel branch, the Rainwell crest, struck into a heavy gold signet ring on the outstretched hand of the man now lying motionless on the cold marble floor of his own house. Duke Rainwell, the most powerful nobleman in the county. A man whose name made members of Parliament choose their words with far more care. A man whose cold disapproval had reportedly ended careers, broken engagements, and altered the courses of lives belonging to people far more significant than a lady's maid named Lettie Graves, who was currently crouching over him with a polished silver tray, still warm in both hands, and flour dust she had not managed to fully brush from her apron. I rose to my feet. My knees were barely holding the rest of me upright. His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the flickering candlelight, unfocused for several long and terrible seconds. Then they sharpened. They found my face and fixed there with an intensity that made the walls of the corridor feel as though they had moved 2 feet closer. It was not the sharp confusion of a man waking in a strange place. It was not anger. Not yet. It was something I could not name with any precision, something older and far more deliberate than either of those things, and it pinned me where I stood more effectively than any lock or chain could have done. He said one word. You. Not who you are, or not what have you done. Not I will have you dismissed before morning, which would have been the most reasonable thing to say under the circumstances. Just you. Spoken quietly, with a weight behind it that made no sense at all, as though he had been expecting to find exactly this at the end of a long road, even if this was not quite the version of it he had imagined. I opened my mouth. My voice had completely abandoned the rest of me. He pressed one hand to the floor and pushed himself upright, and I watched in hollow, frozen horror as a thin line of dark red appeared just above his temple where the edge of the tray had caught him. I had drawn blood. On a duke. in his own house. With a tray I had been polishing not 20 minutes before. My mother's face came to me with full force, her careful, tired eyes, her thin fingers refolding my letters over and over in the small room above the baker's shop, where she waited every month for the coins that allowed her to keep waiting. If I lost this position, I lost the one thing standing between her and a situation I could not let myself imagine clearly. And I would lose it because I had knocked a duke unconscious in a darkened hallway while he was quietly returning to his own home. "I thought," I said, and my voice came out small and torn at the edges. "I thought you were a thief." He stood fully upright and looked down at me. He was taller than I had truly understood before this moment. Standing at full height, he filled the corridor in a way the shadows seemed to arrange themselves around, as though even darkness kept a respectful distance. He was not wearing his formal coat, a loose white shirt, or dark riding trousers, boots still carrying the dust of a long road. He had clearly ridden back tonight unannounced, without sending word, and had moved through his own home without lighting a lamp, for reasons I could not begin to guess at, which meant the entire household had been unaware of his return, which meant my catastrophic mistake was, at least by some very narrow margin, not entirely my doing. I held on to that narrow margin the way a drowning woman holds a thin rope. "The Portman estate was robbed 3 weeks ago," I pressed on, because the silence between us was alive with something dangerous, and words, even clumsy and tumbling ones, felt safer than letting it grow unchallenged. Mrs. Grubb told all of us to act without delay if we saw anything that looked wrong. "You were not carrying a lamp, Your Grace, and no one had told the staff you were coming back tonight, and I had no way of knowing who you were until I had already—" "Stop!" The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It arrived with the kind of quiet precision that had never required volume to make its meaning felt. It simply landed, and the room around it became very still. I stopped. He looked at me for a long, unreadable moment. One hand was pressed lightly to the side of his head. His dark eyes moved across my face, the way you read something you are not yet certain you believe. Then he exhaled once, slowly and with great control, turned slightly to look down the empty corridor, and then turned back to me. "Go to your room," he said. That was all. 4 quiet words, placed down with neither threat nor warmth beneath them. No instruction to Mr. Fettle, no summoning of the night footman, no command to have me removed from the premises under escort. He simply turned and walked away from me through the dark corridor, his footsteps measured and unhurried, and disappeared into the deep shadow of the east wing until there was nothing left of him at all, except the faint sound of a door closing somewhere far at the other end of the hall. I stood in the corridor for a very long time after the sound faded. Not because I was calm, because I could not yet make my legs do anything purposeful. What had just happened was not dismissal, but it was not forgiveness either. It was something held between those two things in a space I had no word for, and it followed me all the way down the back stairs and along the narrow passage to my room, where I sat on the edge of my bed in my apron, with my hands pressed flat on my knees, and shook from my shoulders to my feet. I did not sleep a single hour that night. By the time grey morning light began pressing itself under the curtain at the small window of my room, I had already straightened my uniform 4 times, repinned my hair so firmly that my scalp ached, and worked through at least 6 different versions of the apology I intended to give before being quietly told to pack my belongings and leave. Each version I built carefully in my head, and then dismantled again, because each one sounded, in its own particular way, like something that would only make everything worse. The servants' hall at Blackmere Manor during the early morning hours was its own small and complicated world. It had rules and rhythms that had nothing to do with the grander house above it, a hierarchy as precise and rigid in its way as anything the titled families upstairs had ever constructed. I had learned it slowly and carefully in the 8 months since arriving, the same way I had learned everything in my life. By watching far more than I spoke. By understanding the room before I decided where to stand in it. Dotty Finch was the first to settle herself across from me, at the long wooden table with her bowl of porridge and her enormous, observant eyes that never stopped collecting information on everyone around her. Dotty was 17, the youngest kitchen maid, and easily the most emotionally perceptive person in the entire building, including the family upstairs, was a quality that in my present state I found considerably less charming than usual. "You have the look of someone who spent the night swallowing something bad," she announced, very pleasantly, as though this were a perfectly normal observation to make over breakfast. "Eat your porridge, Dotty," I said. Old Thomas was already settled at the far end of the table with his morning tea. He sat the way he always sat, which was the way of a man who appeared to be doing very little while actually registering everything happening in the room around him. Thomas had served Blackmere for 31 years. He carried more knowledge about this house and the family who owned it than any of us could reasonably guess, and he held nearly all of it inside him with a stillness that was either pure loyalty or something far more complex. His pale eyes moved to my face when Dotty spoke, and stayed there just a fraction of a second longer than they needed to. Bess, who was the senior housemaid and never missed an opportunity to notice what she was not supposed to know, came through the door from the kitchen passage and sat down beside Dotty with her tea and a piece of bread. Bess was practical and sharp, and had a talent for asking questions that sounded casual and were not. She looked at me once, looked away, and then looked back at me again with the expression of someone filing something away for later. At the head of the table, Mr. Fettle was running his spectacles along the morning schedule with the focused devotion of a man who genuinely found administrative order beautiful. But he was tall and angular, and moved through every room as though he had been specifically measured for it. He had a way of pronouncing the name of any servant who had erred that turned those syllables into something capable of drawing blood. I had been bracing for it since I sat down. Every time he shifted the paper in his hand, every time he cleared his precise and narrow throat, I prepared myself for the 2 words that would end everything. Lettie Graves. But they did not come. Mrs. Grubb arrived and sat down with the particular force of a woman who had already made 4 decisions before she touched her chair. She set her teacup on the table with a sound like a gavel. "His Grace returned last evening," she said, without looking at anyone in particular, which in her method of speaking meant she was looking at everyone. "Unannounced. As is his custom, and as will presumably continue to be his custom, regardless of any preference we might hold on the matter. The house is to be at full readiness by 9:30. I want the east receiving room aired and the fire set before 8. The table adjusted invisibly, every posture in the room lifted by 1/2 inch. Dotty's spoon went still in her bowl. Thomas set his cup down with a slightly more careful quality of attention than before. Even Bess stopped tearing her bread and looked momentarily at the far wall. I kept my eyes on the grain of the table in front of me and let out the smallest, most carefully controlled breath I had available. Nobody knew. The realization moved through me in layers, each one taking a moment to settle and be believed. The Duke had returned to his rooms the previous night, bled quietly at his own temple, and said nothing. No note to Mr. Fettle, no quiet instruction to Preston, No word to Mrs. Grubb about the incident in the upper corridor, with the tray and the maid who had not paused long enough to ask a single sensible question before swinging it. He had simply gone to his rooms and to his rest and said nothing to anyone. I could not decide if that was mercy extended to me or a threat being held in reserve. The morning moved with agonizing slowness. I worked through every assigned task with the hollow and mechanical precision of someone who has directed all of their real attention toward fear, and left only the outer shell of themselves to do the actual work. I made beds in the upper rooms with corners so tight and exact they could have passed inspection at a military school. But I carried linens from the press. I dusted the 3 large paintings in the Eastern Gallery, including the portrait of the late Duke, the current man's father, whose painted expression was famously severe, and who now seemed, in my heightened and fragile state, to be watching me with a very personal kind of judgment. It was just before 11 when Preston appeared in the doorway of the east sitting room where I was working. He was a composed man. Preston, the sort of composure that comes from years of practice until it stops being effort and simply becomes the shape of how a person exists in the world. He was somewhere in his middle 40s, always impeccably dressed, always wearing the expression of someone listening to a sound the rest of the room had not yet begun to hear. He had been the Duke's personal valet for 12 years, which meant he had seen things inside that household that no one else would ever know about, and he carried the weight of all of it without any visible sign of the burden. "Miss Graves," he said. "His Grace would like a word." In the study. Every nerve in my body rang at once, like a struck bell left in an empty church. "Of course," I said, and I set down the cloth in my hand and walked after him. The walk from the east sitting room to the Duke's private study was the longest I had made since arriving at Blackmere 8 months before. Preston moved ahead of me at a measured and unhurried pace through the main corridor, up the wide staircase, past the portrait gallery, where 12 generations of Rainwell men watched me from their heavy gilded frames with painted eyes that all carried, to a remarkable degree, the same expression. The expression of people who did not explain themselves and did not expect to be asked to. Preston knocked once on the study door with 2 knuckles, opened it and stepped aside. I walked in. The room was large and lined with books on 3 sides, from the floor to the very top of the walls. Cold white morning light came through the tall windows across from the door, falling in long rectangles across the wide mahogany desk where the Duke sat. He was fully and formally dressed, every part of his appearance composed and perfectly assembled, as though the night before had simply not been a part of his personal history. If he had been shaken, there was nothing remaining of it. He looked as though he had slept deeply, risen early, and proceeded with his day in the logical and organized manner he presumably always employed, except for the small or neat bandage visible just above his left temple. He was reading something, or appearing to read it, and he did not lift his eyes from the page when I entered. He let me stand for a full, excruciating minute in which I counted my own heartbeats and tried very hard not to look at the bandage and failed completely. Then he set the paper aside and looked at me. "Sit down." I sat in the chair positioned across from the desk. I folded my hands in my lap and kept my back precisely straight, because if I allowed my posture to soften even slightly, I was afraid the rest of me might follow. "You told no one," he said. It was not posed as a question. "No, Your Grace." "Why not?" I met his eyes, because looking away felt like admitting to something worse than what had actually taken place. I was frightened, and I believed that speaking of it would only make the situation more difficult to account for. Something shifted in his expression without altering its surface in any visible way. "You have been here 8 months," he said. "Yes, before Blackmere. Lady Tremaine's household in Dorset. 2 years. Before that, I worked for the head mistress of a school in Somerset." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at me with the attention of someone reading a document they intend to understand thoroughly before committing to any position on it. "The tray," he said. My face warmed. "Yes, Your Grace." You did not hesitate. Mrs. Grubb had told the staff, too. I am aware of what Mrs. Grubb told the staff. Not sharp, simply a statement placed there to clear away the underbrush so the actual question had room. I want to know what you were thinking, or in that particular moment, before you moved. I took a steady breath. I was thinking that if I waited even 1 more second, I would find a reason not to do it. And I have learned over time that when I talk myself out of acting in a moment that requires action, I regret the hesitation far longer than I would have regretted the mistake. The room was extremely quiet. He looked at me for a long time, long enough that I became aware of the fire in the grate behind him and the voices of the gardeners somewhere in the grounds below the window, distant and ordinary and entirely separate from this room, which felt like it existed in its own particular atmosphere. Something moved through his expression, quieter than surprise, older than consideration. "You will not be dismissed," he said, "or you acted in accordance with the instruction you had been given in good faith. The fault in the situation was mine. I returned to the house at an unreasonable hour without sending a word, and I moved without a lamp because I did not want to disturb anyone who was sleeping. I blinked. I had prepared for many things in the long, sleepless hours before this morning. I had not prepared for him to say that. "Thank you, Your Grace," I managed. "That is all." He retrieved his paper and returned his eyes to it. I stood, curtsied, and crossed the room to the door. My hand closed on the handle. "Lettie." His voice behind me stopped my hand before it turned the handle even a fraction of an inch. "Yes, Your Grace." He did not look up from the paper. "In the future," he said quietly, "it may be worth asking a question first, or before reaching for the nearest available object." I stood very still for exactly 2 full seconds. "Yes, Your Grace," I said. "Good morning." I let myself out. In the corridor outside the study, with the door closed firmly behind me, I pressed my back flat against the wall and breathed, long and slow, until something inside my chest stopped pressing upward against my ribs. He had not dismissed me. He had not punished me. He had not reprimanded me in any way that left a mark. What he had done was stranger and more difficult to manage than any of those things. He had spoken to me like a person whose words had actual weight. He had asked what I was thinking, and then he had listened to what I said, truly listened, with his full attention and without the particular blankness that most people of his position arranged over their faces when a servant spoke. He had called me by my first name, not Miss Graves, not girl, not you there. Lettie. Twice. I walked back down the corridor toward the east wing with my hands folded and my apron smooth and my expression arranged into something I hoped looked professional and unremarkable. But inside my chest, something had quietly, and without any permission from me, begun to warm. Something small and persistent, like an ember with no business burning in the kind of careful, practical heart that a girl in my position was supposed to have and to protect. I told myself it was a relief. Simple relief. The relief of a woman who had expected to be sent away and instead been told she could stay. I already knew, or somewhere beneath that reasonable and sensible explanation, that it was not relief at all. And that was the part that frightened me most. 3 days passed before I saw him again, and those 3 days were some of the strangest I had ever spent inside any house. Nothing had been said. Nothing had changed on the surface of things. The routines of Blackmere Manor moved forward with the same unbroken rhythm they always had. The fires lit at the same hour, the meals prepared and carried and served, the linens changed, the corridors swept, the windows polished until they showed you your own face back at you with an honesty that sometimes felt unkind. From the outside, nothing was different. From the inside of my own skin, absolutely everything was. I was aware of him in the way you become aware of a change in the weather before the sky has shown any visible sign of it. A particular quality of attention had entered the house along with his return. Or perhaps it had always been there, and I had simply never been its object before. I would be working in the east sitting room and hear footsteps in the corridor outside and feel my hands go completely still on whatever I was holding until the footsteps passed. I would carry a tea tray through the main hall and find my eyes moving without my permission to the closed study door, checking without meaning to for the thin line of light beneath it that meant he was inside. Dotty noticed. Of course, Dotty noticed. As Dotty Finch noticed everything that moved or breathed within 20 feet of her, and filed it away with the efficiency of a woman twice her age, and with considerably more occasion to collect secrets. "You've gone quiet," she told me on the morning of the second day, settling beside me in the linen room with a pile of pressed sheets that she set down with great care before turning to look at me with those large and entirely too perceptive eyes of hers. "I am always quiet," I said, which was true. "You are usually a different kind of quiet," she said, which was also unfairly true. The kind that comes from thinking about something specific. I handed her a folded sheet without looking at her face. "Help me count these." She counted, but she did not stop watching me, and I could feel her attention, the same way you feel the warmth of a fire from across a room. Old Thomas, at the far end of the table that evening, set his cup down once and looked at me for a moment longer than necessary before going back to his tea. That was all he did. With Thomas, that was enough to communicate that he had formed a complete and probably accurate theory about the state of things, and had chosen, in his careful and particular way, to keep it inside where it would do less damage than speaking it aloud. Bess had not asked me anything directly, but Bess had a way of being near you when something was happening that required no questions at all, a physical proximity that served all the same functions. She had been beside me in the laundry, beside me in the upper gallery, beside me folding the linen on the second evening, and each time she had said nothing, but had been very thoroughly present, which was its own kind of asking. On the morning of the third day, everything shifted again. I was in the portrait gallery when I heard the arrival. The sound of carriage wheels on the front gravel reached me faintly through the tall windows, followed by the unmistakable, quickened quality of movement downstairs that signaled unexpected visitors of importance. I set down my clothes and moved to the window at the far end of the gallery, the one that looked over the front approach and looked down. 2 carriages had come through the gates. The first was an elegant, well-kept vehicle, bearing a crest I recognized after a moment as belonging to the Stanhope family, the minor nobility from 2 counties over whose name came up occasionally in the household gossip with the slightly charged quality that meant there was history attached to it. The second was a hired coach, less polished but moving with purpose. From the first carriage stepped a woman who commanded attention, the way certain people do without any apparent effort, simply by the way they occupied space. She was perhaps 30, tall and beautifully composed, dressed in travelling clothes that had clearly been made by someone who understood their work very well. She had the kind of face that carried its own weather, bright when she chose and capable, you could see immediately, of becoming considerably less so. Her name I would learn within the hour from Dotty, who had learned it from the footman who had helped with the luggage, was Lady Constance Stanhope, cousin to the Duke on his mother's side, and, by all accounts, entirely accustomed to the run of Blackmere whenever she chose to visit. From the second coach came 2 other women, younger, one of whom was clearly a lady's maid and moved accordingly, and the other of whom carried herself with the particular upright confidence of someone who is not family, but has been permitted to travel in company with family, often enough to have grown comfortable with the association. Her name, I gathered, was Miss Portia Dench, a companion and close friend to Lady Constance, and she had the sharp, watchful eyes of someone who was always the second most important person in any room, and had long since decided that position suited her perfectly. Behind them came a man I had not expected. He was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, moving with the ease of someone who had spent a great deal of time outdoors and had never lost the habit of it. He wore his clothes well, but not with the particular care of a man who thought much about them. His face was pleasant and open, with a directness in his expression that was almost startling in contrast to the careful, layered quality of most of the faces I encountered in houses like this one. He was introduced to Mr. Fettle at the door as Sir Aldous Frey, a baronet from the north of England, and an old friend of the Duke's from his years at university. Within 20 minutes, Blackmere Manor had changed its entire character. The house that had been moving through its quiet, to carefully ordered days in the cool shadow of the Duke's solitary return, was suddenly full of voices and movement, and the specific energy that arrives with guests who know each other well enough to be entirely at ease in one another's company. Fires were lit in 3 additional rooms. Mrs. Grubb communicated new instructions to the household staff with the focused intensity of a general preparing for engagement and only slightly less warmth. Dotty flew between the kitchen and the upper floors with the barely contained excitement of someone who lived for exactly this quality of disruption. I worked and watched and said very little, which was my usual way, and through the measured, unremarkable motion of my duties, I began to understand the shape of things. Lady Constance was here with a purpose. I could feel it in the way she moved through the house, taking her ease in every room with the familiarity of someone who had grown up visiting here, but carrying beneath that ease a watchfulness that had nothing relaxed about it. She asked Mr. Fettle precise questions about the household schedule, questions that sounded casual and were not. She went twice to the study door and twice came away from it. She had not yet spoken to the Duke. Miss Portia Dench watched everything that Lady Constance did and filed it carefully, and she watched me once, across the width of the main hall, with the particular attention of someone who has identified something they do not yet understand, but fully intend to. It was Sir Aldous Frey who surprised me. I was carrying a tray of afternoon tea things along the corridor, toward the green sitting room, where Lady Constance and Miss Dench had settled, when he stepped out of the library to my left without warning, and nearly walked directly into me. I stopped fast. The cups rattled, but held. "Forgive me," he said immediately, stepping back, and his voice had the warmth of someone who genuinely meant it, rather than simply performing the social form of it. I was not looking where I was going. "Are you all right?" "Perfectly, sir. Thank you," I said, the automatic smoothness of the trained servant covering the fact that I had, for one unguarded moment, nearly dropped the entire tray on a baronet's boots. He looked at me with that direct, open expression of his. "You must be one of Mrs. Grubb's people." I remember Mrs. Grubb. Or does she still arrange her face as though the house is permanently on the edge of some catastrophe she alone can prevent? I kept my expression completely neutral. Mrs. Grubb runs an excellent household, sir. Something in his eyes brightened. A diplomat, he said, almost to himself. Rainwell always did keep a good staff. He stepped aside to let me pass, which was itself a small and unremarkable courtesy that I noted and stored. The afternoon developed its complications. At 4 o'clock, I was called to the green sitting room to attend Lady Constance. Lady Constance's own maid, a composed and faintly superior woman named Ruth, was occupied with the unpacking of her mistress's things and could not be spared, and so I was sent in her place. Well, Lady Constance received me in the sitting room with the particular quality of attention that very self-possessed women give to staff when they are in the process of deciding what to make of you. She asked me to arrange the fire and bring fresh hot water and repin a brooch that had come loose on the shoulder of her travelling garment, and while I performed each of these tasks, she spoke with Miss Dench about things that were not quite addressed to me, and not quite not addressed to me, which is a technique some women of her class use so skillfully that they can gather a great deal of information about a person without ever appearing to ask directly. Miss Dench said something about the house feeling rather quieter than she had expected, given the Duke's return. That Lady Constance said that Rainwell had always preferred quiet when he was thinking through something, and he had clearly been thinking through something since arriving back from the Whitmore hunting party 4 days early and without explanation. Miss Dench said she had heard, from Ruth, who had spoken with Preston in the hall, that there had been some kind of incident on the Duke's first night home. I kept my hands completely steady on the brooch clasp and my eyes on my work. Lady Constance said that Preston never spoke about household matters, which was one of the reasons the Duke kept him, and that whatever the incident was, it had evidently not disturbed Rainwell's composure enough to alter his habits, which meant it was either very minor or very interesting. Miss Dench said she thought it was the second one. I finished repinning the brooch, stepped back, and said that I hoped the room was comfortable and that I would bring fresh water from the kitchen directly. Lady Constance thanked me in a pleasant voice and turned back to Miss Dench, and I left. In the corridor outside, I walked at my normal speed and breathed at something that aspired to my normal rate and thought about nothing in particular until I reached the back stairs. Then I stopped on the landing and pressed one hand flat against the cold wall and let myself understand what had just happened. They knew something had occurred. Not what? Not exactly. But enough. And Miss Dench had the particular quality of mind that would keep pulling at a loose thread until either the thread came free or the whole thing unravelled. I went to fetch the water and told myself it was not my concern. But at 7 o'clock, the household prepared for dinner. I was not part of the dinner service. My duties during formal evenings belonged to the upper floors and the guest rooms, and so I moved through the quieter parts of the house, while the kitchen below me produced the sounds and smells of a meal being assembled at pace, and the footmen prepared the dining room with the focused seriousness they gave to any event where the Duke would be present. I was in the upstairs corridor outside the guest rooms, changing the towels in the linen cabinet, when I heard the study door open below and the measured weight of the Duke's footsteps move across the hall toward the drawing room. Then I heard Lady Constance's voice, clear and carrying through the high ceilings of the house. "You look dreadful, Rainwell. What on earth happened to your head?" A pause. "A minor incident," said the Duke's voice. Even from upstairs it carried its particular quality. Even separated from me by a floor and a corridor and 2 closed doors, it arrived with the same settled, unhurried weight it always had. "Minor incidents do not require bandages," said Lady Constance. Another pause. "It is being managed," he said. The drawing-room door closed. I stood in the corridor with a folded towel in both hands, and a heart that was doing something entirely unreasonable and quite beyond my authority to stop. He had told her it was being managed. He had not said it was nothing. He had not said there was no incident. He had said it was being managed, which meant, in the careful language of a man who chose every word with precision, that it existed, that he was attending to it, that it was something being held, rather than dismissed. I put the towel in the cabinet and closed the door, and went on with my work. The dinner that evening lasted nearly 2 hours, and when it was over, the house took on the particular, rearranged quality that always followed a large meal, the fires lower, the voices quieter, the movement of people through rooms having the slightly loosened and less guarded character of an evening winding toward its natural end. I was collecting the last of the upper corridor candelabras to be cleaned when Dotty appeared at the end of the hall with the expression of someone carrying news too warm to hold inside much longer. "Mr. Fettle wants you," she said, and then added, "because she could not help herself, and he does not look cross, which is the unusual part." I went downstairs. Mr. Fettle was waiting in the small room beside the butler's pantry, where he conducted the quieter pieces of household business, the kind that did not need an audience. He gestured at the chair across from his desk with the particular economy of movement that characterized everything he did. I sat. "His Grace has made a request," he said, in the tone he used for things that required no decoration. "He has asked that you be assigned to the service of his guests during their stay, in addition to your usual duties. Lady Constance's maid is unwell this evening, and Miss Dench has no personal maid with her. The Duke has requested specifically that you serve in that capacity." I held everything very still inside me. "Of course, Mr. Fettle," I said. He looked at me over his spectacles for exactly 1 second longer than the conversation required. "You will conduct yourself with the usual standard," he said. "Yes, Mr. Fettle. That will be all." I stood, curtsied, and left. In the passage outside, I kept walking at a steady pace, and did not allow my face to do anything it was not supposed to do. He had asked for me specifically. Those words arranged themselves in a row in my mind, and I pushed them firmly aside and focused on the practical facts of what had just been assigned to me, because the practical facts were manageable, and the other thing was not. Ruth, Lady Constance's maid, was not in fact unwell. I discovered this almost immediately upon going upstairs to present myself. She was sitting in the small room adjoining the guest suite, quite well and composed, darning a pair of stockings with the focused attention of a woman who has been told to make herself scarce for the evening and has decided to be useful while doing so. She looked up at me when I appeared and looked back down at her stockings with the expression of someone who had already had this conversation and resolved it to her own satisfaction. Lady Constance was seated before the small writing desk in the guest suite, a letter half composed before her, when I knocked and entered. Miss Dench was in the chair by the fire with a book held open in her lap and the look of someone who was not reading it. Lady Constance turned and looked at me, and then looked at me again with a quality of attention that was slightly different from the one she had used in the afternoon. It was the look of someone who has been given information between then and now, and is in the process of fitting it into a picture. "You are Lettie Graves," she said. "Yes, my lady." "How long have you been at Blackmere?" 8 months, my lady." She turned back to her letter but did not pick up her pen. Miss Dench stopped pretending to read and set her book aside with the unhurried care of a woman who had just been given permission to pay full attention. "My cousin has asked for you specifically," Lady Constance said to the letter on the desk in front of her. "Which is interesting. He has never requested a specific staff member for anything. In 11 years of my knowing this household well, I have never heard him request a specific servant for a social function. I said nothing because nothing I could say would improve the situation. "You may help me undress," said Lady Constance, and she rose from the desk. I helped her undress. I unpinned her hair, which was thick and dark and required careful handling, and I performed every part of the task with the smooth proficiency that had been built over years until it required no active thought to execute. While I worked, Lady Constance spoke. Not to me, exactly. Or rather, she spoke in my direction in a way that allowed her to observe how I received things. She spoke about the Duke, about his character, his habits, the particular architecture of his silences. She spoke about how he had been after his father died, 4 years before, how the house had changed around him, and he had changed inside it, how the man who had arrived at the title had been and remained someone who controlled every room he occupied, not with force, but with the gravity of a person who has learned that their attention carries its own weight. She spoke about the people who had tried to reach him and found it difficult, and the people who had stopped trying and found it easier. She spoke about a woman named Miss Theodora Vance, who had been widely considered the most likely candidate for the Duchess of Rainwell 2 seasons before, and about the particular quality of the Duke's courteous and complete indifference to that prospect, which had been visible to everyone except Miss Theodora Vance until the very end of the 2nd season. She spoke about the fact that her cousin was, at heart, a man who had never in his adult life shown visible interest in anything that had not earned it. I held her hairpins and kept my face professional and said nothing. "There," she said, when the last pin was out and her hair was properly braided for the night. "That will do nicely. You have a good hand." "Thank you, my lady." She looked at me in the mirror. It was a long look, direct and without pretense, the look of a woman who had decided to stop being subtle and had made that decision with the same composure she brought to everything else. "He told Aldous about the tray," she said. The room did not change. The fire kept burning. Miss Dench kept her expression carefully arranged. My hands kept holding the small silver pin dish I had been using to collect the hairpins, and my face kept its professional composure. And somewhere inside my chest, something performed a full and acrobatic revolution. "He said it was the funniest thing that had happened to him in 4 years," said Lady Constance. "And that is how I know it matters." She took the pin dish gently from my hands, set it on the dressing table, and picked up her own hairbrush. "You may go," she said, pleasantly. "Good night, Lettie." I walked back through the corridor and down the back stairs, and all the way to the end of the lower passage before I stopped moving. I stood in the dark of the passage with one hand on the wall and breathed the way you breathe when something has happened that rearranged the furniture of everything you thought you understood. He had told Sir Aldous about the tray. He had told his oldest friend about a moment in a dark corridor that he could have simply never mentioned to anyone alive. He had described it as the funniest thing that had happened to him in 4 years, which, coming from a man whose face gave away almost nothing, and who chose his words like each one cost him something, was the equivalent of another man saying it had turned his whole world a different color. I knew what I was supposed to do with that. I was supposed to fold it neatly inside me and leave it there and go on being a lady's maid with flour on her apron and a mother in a small room above a baker's shop and a position I could not afford to lose, and a heart that had absolutely no business warming itself at the fireside of a duke's passing attention. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at my hands in my lap. Outside the narrow window, the grounds of Blackmere Manor were very quiet under the night sky, the dark shapes of the hedges and the silver length of the path that led from the main house to the gate. And beyond the gate the road that led to all the ordinary places I had come from, and would presumably, in the natural order of things, eventually return to. The next morning arrived with a cold, clear light and a frost on the grass that turned the grounds into something severe and beautiful. I was in the kitchen passage at 6:30 when I encountered Sir Aldous Frey moving through it with the cheerful purposefulness of a man who had gone for an early walk and found it invigorating. He was carrying a small bunch of pale winter berries he had evidently picked from somewhere on the grounds, or for no discernible reason, which for some reason made him seem exactly like the kind of person who would do that. "Miss Graves," he said, because he had learned my name between yesterday and today, which was itself a small thing I noticed. "You are up early." "I am always up early, sir." "So is Rainwell," he said, with the comfortable ease of someone who has known a person long enough to speak of them without dressing the words up first. "He has been up since 5. He is in the stables, which means he is thinking about something he does not want to think about inside the house." I looked at Sir Aldous Frey, and he looked at me with his direct and pleasant face, and neither of us said anything for a moment. "The berries are for the breakfast table," he said, by way of explanation, holding up the small bunch. "Constance likes them." "I can take them to the kitchen, sir, if you like." He handed them over with a nod and went on down the passage, and I went to the kitchen, and that was all. But something in the way he had told me about the stables, the easy, uncomplicated way he had offered the information, as though it were simply a fact about the morning that he thought I might find relevant, stayed with me while I worked through the first tasks of the day. At 8:30, I was sent to the stables to collect a message that had arrived by rider from the house of Mr. Declan Marsh, the Duke's land steward, who managed the Rainwell estates and communicated through the stables when matters required the Duke's attention before the formal post arrived. I took the note from the groom, to a young man named Pip, who had been at Blackmere since he was 12, and moved through the stable yard with the sureness of someone entirely at home in it, and I started back toward the house. The Duke was at the far end of the stable block. He was standing with one hand on the neck of a dark horse, not riding, not preparing to ride, simply standing in the particular stillness of a person who has gone somewhere to be alone with their own thinking, and has not yet found what they came looking for. He was not wearing his formal coat, a riding jacket, plain and dark, and the quiet, undefended quality of a man who does not know he is being observed. He turned before I reached the door. Of course he did. He looked at me across the length of the stable block, and I looked at him, and the frost on the yard outside, and the smell of hay and cold air and horses were all exactly as they were, and made no comment whatsoever. I held up the note. "From Mr. Marsh, Your Grace. A rider just brought it." He crossed the space between us and took the note from my hand. Our fingers did not touch. There was no reason they should have. And yet the small, precise distance that did not allow them to touch was itself a thing I was aware of. He read the note in a single pass of his eyes, folded it, and put it in his coat. He did not turn away. "Lady Constance spoke with you last evening," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. She has a habit of speaking plainly when she has decided something." "She was very kind, Your Grace." He looked at me with an expression that was not quite the formal, undissembled thing he wore in the study, and was not quite the unfocused rawness of the man who had opened his eyes in a dark corridor with blood on his temple. It was something between those two things, something that existed in the space he showed only when he was not performing the position he occupied. "I owe you an apology," he said. I waited. "I moved through my own house in the dark without warning anyone of my return. You responded exactly as you had been instructed to respond. The injury was mine, and the error was mine, and I should have said so more clearly in the study that morning, rather than hiding it behind the language of formal procedure." The stable yard was very quiet. Pip had gone somewhere farther inside the block. The horse at the end shifted its weight and exhaled a warm, visible breath into the cold air. "But you said it plainly enough, Your Grace," I said. "I said it correctly," he replied. "That is not always the same thing." I looked at him, and he looked at me, and the cold morning held us both in it for a moment that was separate from everything else going on inside that house. "Thank you, Your Grace," I said. And then, because something in me had decided that the narrow margin I had been holding on to deserved to be properly acknowledged, I added, "I am sorry I struck you." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something quieter and more genuine than a smile, something that only appeared because he had not had time to prevent it. "You are forgiven," he said. "Go back inside before you catch a cold, Lettie." I went back inside. As I walked the entire length of the path between the stables and the kitchen door, and felt the frost under my feet, and the cold air on my face, and the impossible, impractical, entirely unauthorized warmth sitting in the center of my chest, like something that had decided to stay. He had called me Lettie again. Just Lettie. Not Miss Graves, not girl, not the formal courtesy that a man of his position owed to no one below him, and least of all to a maid who had knocked him unconscious in a corridor. Just my name, said plainly, in the cold morning air of a stable yard, like it was the most natural word in the world. I had enough sense to know that this was where careful women stopped and took stock of themselves and the world they actually lived in. I also had enough honesty, at last, or to admit that I had passed that point somewhere in the dark of a corridor 3 nights before, when a pair of very dark eyes had opened and found my face and said one word that had no business meaning what it had meant. And so I walked back through the kitchen door into the warmth of Blackmere Manor and put my apron on and got back to work, because that was the only part of any of this that I knew with certainty how to do. But the warmth in my chest came inside with me, and it stayed. The morning after the stable yard, Lady Constance decided she wanted to walk the grounds. This was announced at breakfast with the authority of someone who does not invite discussion on such matters, and within 30 minutes, the household had arranged itself around the decision. Sir Aldous declared himself delighted to join her, and Miss Dench put on her warmest coat. Preston appeared with the Duke's gloves without being asked, which meant the Duke was also going, which meant the entire arrangement had been organized around something other than fresh air and exercise. I was assigned to carry the walking basket. This was not an unusual task. It was, in fact, one of the most ordinary things a housemaid could be asked to do on a fine winter morning. I told myself this very firmly, as I fell into position, a respectable distance behind the group, and we moved out through the side garden toward the long path that ran along the edge of the Rainwell grounds. Lady Constance walked with Sir Aldous at the front, talking with the easy, shorthand fluency of people who have known each other long enough to skip the surface of things entirely. Miss Dench walked slightly behind them, her sharp eyes moving across the grounds with the appreciative attention of someone making careful mental notes. The Duke walked at the edge of the group, slightly apart, in the manner he occupied most spaces, present and yet arranged around a particular inner distance that most people respected without being told to. He fell back. It happened gradually, naturally, in the way that things which have been quietly intended tend to happen. Lady Constance's conversation with Sir Aldous deepened into something that drew both of them forward at a slightly faster pace. Miss Dench moved to join them, because Miss Dench always moved toward the centre of things, and the Duke slowed, and the distance between the front of the group and the back of it grew to something that was, by any reasonable measure, a private space. I kept my eyes forward and my steps measured. "You are carrying that basket as though it contains something fragile," said his voice, just to my left. "It contains Lady Constance's sketching materials, Your Grace. They are fragile." "She has not sketched anything in 11 years, he said. I looked at him. He was looking ahead, his expression carrying that quiet, internal amusement that rarely reached his face all the way. "Then she packed them to give me something to carry," I said. "Yes," he said. "She did." We walked for a moment in the cold, clean air of the Rainwell grounds, the frost still sitting in the shadows where the morning sun had not yet reached, the bare branches of the old trees making their precise, dark shapes against the pale sky. The voices of Lady Constance and Sir Aldous carried back to us faintly, and punctuated by laughter that had the easy warmth of long friendship. "My father used to walk this path every morning," the Duke said. "He did not say it as though it were information. He said it the way you say things you have carried a long time and have decided, in a particular moment, to set down briefly and look at." "Preston told us," I said carefully. "When I first arrived. He said the late Duke believed the grounds were best understood on foot. He believed most things were best understood by going directly toward them." He paused. "I have not always followed that particular principle." The path curved, and the main house came into view behind us, its grey stone catching the winter light in a way that made it look both permanent and somehow fragile. I kept walking, and did not say anything, but because the silence he was offering was not the kind that needed filling. "There is a matter being discussed in London," he said after a moment, "among my family's advisers. A question of the estate's future that has been left unresolved for longer than it ought to have been." I waited. "They believe the most sensible resolution involves a particular kind of arrangement," he said, "the kind that requires a duchess." The basket felt heavier suddenly. I kept my eyes on the path. "Lady Constance has come with a name," he continued. "A suitable candidate, appropriate family, appropriate temperament, appropriate understanding of what the role requires. She presented the case last evening at dinner with the efficiency she brings to everything she genuinely wants to accomplish." "She is very persuasive," I said, and my voice came out precisely as steady as I needed it to be, which took more work than it should have. "She is," he agreed. "She is also, on this particular matter, not entirely wrong." We walked another 20 steps. The voices ahead had stopped. Lady Constance had paused to look at something in the hedge, or to create the appearance of looking at something in the hedge, and the distance between us remained exactly as it was. "I find myself," said the Duke, with the careful, deliberate quality of a man choosing words he has already chosen and reconsidered and chosen again, in the unfamiliar position of being persuaded by a reasonable argument and yet unable to feel the reasonableness of it. I stopped walking. He stopped a half step later and turned to look at me, and the winter morning light was on his face, and the bandage at his temple had been replaced by a thin, neat line of healing that would, in another week, be barely visible. "Your Grace," I said, and my voice was careful and honest, and did not pretend. "I am a lady's maid. I carry sketching baskets and change linens and pin brooches and knock people unconscious with servings' trays. The corner of his mouth moved in exactly the way it had moved in the stable yard. "Yes," he said, "and you are the Duke of Rainwell, and Lady Constance has brought you a sensible candidate and a sensible argument, and the entire sensible weight of what your position requires." "Also yes," he said. "Then I am not sure what you are telling me," I said. He looked at me for a long, quiet moment, and the honesty in his face was not something I had expected from a man who controlled every room he entered and had spent years perfecting the art of revealing nothing he had not decided to reveal. "I am telling you," he said, "that I returned to this house 4 days early from a hunting party because I could not sleep, and the countryside felt empty in a way it had not felt before. That I came home in the dark without sending word because I did not know what I was looking for. That I opened my eyes in a dark corridor with your face above me and your candle in your hand, and felt, for the first time in 4 years, that I had arrived somewhere." The frost sat in the shadows. The bare branches did not move. "That is not a sensible thing," I said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." From somewhere ahead, Lady Constance's voice carried back to us lightly on the cold air, saying something about the state of the east hedge that was almost certainly not about the hedge at all. "I am not asking you anything," he said, quietly and plainly. "I am not placing anything on you. I want to be clear about that. What I am telling you is only the truth of where I stand. Because I believe you have earned the truth, and because I am, apparently, constitutionally incapable of being anything other than direct with you, even when direction is the more complicated course." I held the basket and looked at him, and felt everything I had been carefully folding and setting aside for 4 days pressed against the inside of my ribs all at once. "Lady Constance's candidate," I said. "What, is she someone you could respect?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes." "Then you should speak with her," I said. "You should do what your position requires, and I should carry this basket back to the house and press Lady Constance's evening clothes and do what my position requires." I paused. "We live in different worlds inside the same house, Your Grace. That is simply what is true." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the controlled composure of a man accepting something he had already known. "You are the most honest person in this house," he said. "I have nothing to protect myself with except honesty," I said. We walked back to join the others. The grounds were beautiful in the cold light. The conversation at the front of the group resumed. The morning continued, and the warmth in my chest, which I had told to stop and be sensible and remember where it lived, burned on without my permission, because it had never asked for my permission to begin with. 3 days later, Lady Constance left. She came to find me herself, which surprised everyone, including Ruth, who was already supervising the loading of the luggage onto the first carriage and was visibly uncertain about the departure from protocol. Miss Dench stood at the top of the front steps and observed with her careful, recording eyes as Lady Constance crossed the entrance hall and knocked on the door of the small room where I had been instructed to press and pack the last of her travelling clothes. She came in and sat down in the only chair in the room without being invited to, but because Lady Constance did not require an invitation to sit in any room she had entered since the age of 7. "He is not going to meet with Miss Hartley," she said, without preamble. Miss Hartley was apparently the name of the sensible candidate. "He told me last evening, very politely, very finally, in the particular way he has of closing a subject that makes it clear the subject is fully closed, and renegotiation will not be productive." I kept my hands on the coat I was folding. "I am sorry, my lady," I said. "No, you are not," she said pleasantly, "and I am not asking you to be." She looked at me with the direct, decided quality she brought to everything. I have known my cousin for 30 years. I have watched him be courteous to people he did not care about, and silent with people he did. I have never seen him tell someone the truth about the state of his own interior before he had decided exactly what to do about it. I set the coat in the trunk and reached for the next piece. "He will do things correctly," she said. "He will take the time that is required and navigate what needs to be navigated, and do it all with the measured, careful gravity that has always been both his greatest quality and, frankly, his most exhausting one." She stood. "But he will do it. That is what I am telling you. He is a man who does not begin something he does not intend to finish." She moved to the door. "Lady Constance," I said. She paused. "Why are you telling me this?" She looked at me over her shoulder with a small, genuine smile that was entirely different from her public one. "Was because you told him the truth about your world and his world and what stood between them, and you did it with your chin up and your voice steady and your hands holding a basket of sketching materials I have not used since 1814. And I have a great deal of respect for that kind of courage, Lettie Graves, even if you do not yet know that is what it was." She left. Sir Aldous Frey shook my hand when he departed, which was the kind of uncomplicated, egalitarian gesture that made Bess stare from across the hall and Dotty nearly drop a hat box. He shook it, as he would have shaken anyone's hand, firmly and without any quality of performing a condescension, and he said that Blackmere was in fine shape, and that whoever was responsible for the standard of the silver ought to be proud of themselves. But I thanked him and did not mention the tray. The carriages went down the drive. The house settled. The fires burned lower in the guest rooms. Mrs. Grubb reassigned the additional duties. Life at Blackmere Manor resumed its shape. 2 weeks passed. I did not see the Duke privately in those 2 weeks. I saw him in the way that servants see the people they work for, across rooms, at the edges of corridors, in the brief and functional moments where household life requires the two worlds to intersect. He nodded when we passed. I curtsied. The professional surface of things held perfectly, and beneath it, something else held too, quieter and more patient than I had expected it to be. Something that did not press or demand, but simply waited with the steadiness of a thing that had decided where it was. On a Thursday evening in the 3rd week, Aunt Preston came to find me. Not to summon me to the study. He came himself, which was unusual, and he stood in the doorway of the linen room where I was working, and said, with the composed and careful steadiness that characterized every word he ever spoke, that the Duke had asked whether I would care to walk in the upper gallery at 8 o'clock, when the household was settled, if I was willing. If I was willing. I looked at Preston for a moment. "Yes," I said. "Tell him yes." Preston nodded and went. I turned back to the linen shelf and stood there for a full minute without touching anything. The upper gallery at 8 o'clock was lit by the fire at its far end, and the last grey-purple quality of the winter evening coming through the tall windows. The Rainwell ancestors looked down from their gilded frames with their unified painted expression of people who never had to explain themselves, and beneath them the Duke stood with his hands behind his back, looking at the portrait of his father at the far end. He heard me come in. He turned. We stood in the gallery and looked at each other, and the fire made the room warm, and the evening made it quiet. "I wrote to a man named Carver in London," he said. "A solicitor. He manages certain arrangements for the estate." He paused. "I also wrote to the Board of Governors of St. Agatha's School in Somerset." I went very still. "Your previous employer," he said. "Before Lady Tremain's household. The headmistress there wrote back within the week. She described you as the most precisely capable and quietly remarkable young woman she had encountered in 20 years of running that school. He looked at me steadily. I want you to know that I didn't need the letter to reach that conclusion. But I thought you should know that it exists. My throat was very tight. Why did you write to them? Because what I intend to do requires time and care and the navigation of a great many things that are complicated, and I did not want you to spend that time not knowing whether I was serious. He held my gaze with the full, unhurried attention of a man who had decided to stop being indirect about anything. I am entirely serious, Lettie. I want to be clear about that. I am not asking you to wait for a promise. I am giving you one. The fire crackled. The gallery was very still. As you said, we live in different worlds inside the same house, he said. Yes, I said. I have been thinking about that every day since you said it. He took 2 steps toward me and stopped at a respectful distance, and his eyes were dark and steady and entirely without the armored composure he wore for everyone else. You were right. We do. And I am asking you, plainly and honestly, if you are willing to let me close the distance between them. Not immediately. Correctly. In the way that protects you and does not ask you to risk what you cannot afford to risk. My mother's face came to me again, her careful eyes, her thin, waiting hands, the small room above the baker's shop. My mother, I said. Will be provided for, he said immediately, without hesitation, without any quality of offering it as a bargain. Though simply as a fact he had already settled inside himself. That is not a condition, it is not leverage, it is simply what is right. I stood in the upper gallery of Blackmere Manor with the ancestors of the Rainwell family, watching from their frames, and the winter evening pressing at the windows, and the fire burning steadily at the far end of the room. And I looked at the man who had opened his eyes in a dark corridor, and said one word that had started all of this. And I felt the warmth in my chest that had never once obeyed me expand into something I stopped trying to contain. I struck you with a serving tray, I said. You did, he said. On your first night home. Yes. And this is where we arrived. This is exactly where we arrived, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it only moved when he was not guarding it. Real and quiet and entirely his own. I took a breath. Then yes, I said. I am willing. He did not move toward me. He simply looked at me with everything he had been holding behind that careful, armored face for weeks, all of it visible now, warm and sure and patient, and nodded once. Downstairs, Dottie was almost certainly stationed somewhere near the bottom of the gallery stairs with her enormous, perceptive eyes, and a very strong theory about what was happening. Old Thomas was almost certainly in the kitchen with his tea and his 31 years of Blackmere knowledge, quietly unsurprised. Bess was almost certainly filing everything away for later, and I stood in the firelit gallery of a great house with flour I had not quite managed to brush from my apron, and a silver tray I would never again be able to look at without feeling this exact moment rise inside me. And I understood that the world was large and complicated and full of distances that could not always be crossed, but that the ones worth crossing were worth every frightening, impractical, magnificent step. The story of how a lady's maid knocked a duke unconscious with a silver tray and changed the entire course of both their lives didn't begin the way either of them would have planned it. But then, the best ones never do. Now, if this story moved something in you, if you felt Lettie's courage or held your breath in that gallery, tell me in the comments What moment got you the most? And if you are new here, and this is the first story you have heard from us, please hit the subscribe button right now. We have so many more where this one came from, and you do not want to arrive late to the next one.